Okay, so we've just started a new series. Last week, Bodhinaga kicked off the talks of this new series, the series on the great Buddhist texts, which we're calling Thus Have I Heard. And those of you who came to the last series, we were looking at the five jhanas, or the Buddha mandala, the five Buddha mandala. And that's a particular way into the enlightenment experience, if you're going to call it that. It's a particular way into enlightenment, using imagery, using stories. What we're looking at now for this next series, for the next 10, 12 weeks, is we're looking at texts that come out of the Buddhist tradition. And these few weeks, we're starting off with texts that are things that the Buddha presumably said. As far as we know, they're teachings that the Buddha gave. So the Buddha, of course, is the root of what we practice. The Buddha is the first being to become enlightened on his own and in our time. And once he was enlightened, he tried to convey in various teachings his experience. So he tried to convey in a way that we could understand, practices that we could follow that would help us to follow in his footsteps. So that's what we're going to look at with these texts. Last week, Bodhinaga started off with the very first teaching that the Buddha gave to 5 of his companions in the spiritual life. And this week I'm looking at something which is called the Satipatthana Sutta. Thank you. And the Satipatthana Sutta. So this is a key Buddhist text, and it's important in nearly all traditions around the world of Buddhism. It's a pathway to freedom. It's a pathway to freedom of the mind and heart. And it's a discourse on the foundations of mindfulness. So today we're going to be looking at mindfulness awareness as taught by the Buddha in this text, the Satipatthana text. And the Buddha taught it, so as far as we know, to a group of people in the Kuru country. So what would happen is as the Buddha grew a Sangha, people would come to him and they would decide they wanted to go forth. They wanted to become what's called a bhikkhu, or I always want to say bikini, which is not so, not a bikini, a bhikkhuni. So yeah, let's just say bhikkhus from now on, okay, to mean both men and women. And these are people who've gone forth. So sometimes it's translated as monk or nun, but that's not really appropriate because monk or nun kind of have an idea of somebody who lives in a monastery or a convent. These were sort of living a much more wild life than that because they were just going out on their own or in pairs in the jungle of the time, walking about from village to village, and just when they met people who wanted to hear about the Dharma, teaching the Dharma to them. And they really were living a very kind of on-the-edge lifestyle because they were completely dependent on the villagers and the farmers for food. If they couldn't beg food, they wouldn't have anything to eat. And they slept out under trees, they slept in the jungle, they slept in villages and things. They didn't have anywhere, they were literally homeless. So they would come together at different times. They'd come together, so I imagine they're coming together at the full moon. They'd come together in great numbers at the full moon, and the Buddha would give them a teaching. So you can imagine them perhaps in a clearing somewhere, in the jungle, clearing, the full moon shining down, a whole group of people sitting quietly and waiting for the Buddha to talk. So this is the Buddha. The Buddha gave this teaching known as the Satipatthana. Sutta just means thread. So it's a teaching that's come down to us. And it's been passed down in oral tradition. Because actually the Buddha couldn't read or write, nor presumably could most of his disciples. And they actually were passed down in the oral tradition and written down a few hundred years after the Buddha died. So with Buddhist texts like this one, we always need to look at them carefully to check, are they really the word of the Buddha? Because we don't know. It's not obviously they're very meaningful to Buddhists, but it's not holy in the way that, say, the Holy Bible or the Holy Quran. They're very much things that we can look at and investigate and see if they ring true. And I think this one, the Satipatthana Sutta, as far as I know, it's been found in lots of different places, lots of different fragments of it. It looks like it's pretty much was the word of the Buddha, as far as we know, that was passed down. Okay, so what's it about? So last week, Bodhinaga talked about dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness. how we can't escape that by looking outside ourselves for something that's going to make it all right, but the only way to escape it is by growing ourselves, by growing spiritually, by understanding what causes the suffering. And one of the ways that contributes to that is by cultivating awareness and mindfulness. So the Satipatthana Sutta is a very systematic, practical approach to liberating ourselves, to cultivating awareness and mindfulness. So if we were to ask ourselves, well, what we really want, what do we really want for ourselves and others deep down? We might come up with lots of different answers, but some of them we might find that we really want to be free. People often say that. We really want to be happy. So we want to experience a freedom of mind and our heart. We want to have happiness in the sense of contentment. We long for a non-reactive mind, an open heart. Many of us want to be a cause for good in the world, not a destructive force, so that what we do contributes to good in the world, that we're not actually just, we're part of the solution rather than the problem. So what stops us from becoming freer, becoming happier? Well, for most of us who live in this comfortable Sheffield, this comfortable place, this world we live in, it's often our own minds that get in the way. It's our minds. Because we find ourselves really at the mercy of our conditioning, our old patterns. They drive us along without us being aware of it. So we're driven all the time. But awareness can give us choices. It can allow us to steer our lives a little bit more. So if we imagine we're like a little sailing boat out at sea, hopefully not quite stormy conditions like that, but pretty stormy. And we get blown about by winds all the time. We get taken around by currents. And the winds are, our own reactions, our own reactivity to things, acting automatically without thinking about them. But awareness can really help us to take the rudder of that little boat. And I'm not sure actually what you do in that particular storm, apart from hide, but it feels like a little bit less stormy. Take the rudder and to actually become the skipper or captain of our own lives. So we can work with the winds and the currents, and we can go where we want to go, not blown about these winds of our reactivity, of our different urges. So I suppose in a way, gradually becoming an adult is about doing that anyway. Because if you've got a pet dog smells something, it just runs after it. Do you see what I mean? It just acts really automatically. Or little children seem to do the same. It's like 1 minute they're really happy, 1 minute really sad. If they want something, they want it. If they don't want something, they really push it away. And as adults, we gradually, more and more, try to become a bit more in control of what we're up to, a bit more the skipper of our lives. But we're still really blown around. And I suppose, in a way, really growing up is to become enlightened, is to become the Buddha. The Buddha was really grown up, really in charge of his life. So another image that we can use is around the idea of aligning ourselves with reality. So the Buddha became enlightened, he really saw reality, and then he gave us a pathway, many different pathways where we can approach that, where we can align ourselves with what's real. So in our experience, what we do is, if you imagine there's a clear blue sky, which is our mind, and as Mochitari said to me earlier, today's been a really good example of weather, hasn't it? There's been all sorts of weather, blue sky, clouds, hail, it's all been going on. And the clouds you can see as being our emotions and thoughts. So they just come along, different emotions, different thoughts, come into being, pass out of being, come into being, pass out of being. But what we do is we identify ourselves as being those clouds. So we identify with our emotions and thoughts. But actually what the Buddha said is what we really are is the clear blue sky. And quite often those clouds are very turbulent indeed. They can be very grey and dark. And we really identify. So if we're very angry, really caught up in anger, we identify with those clouds. If we're really caught up in craving, we identify with those clouds. But of course, as we know, if you go in a plane, through those turbulent clouds, above, there's always the blue sky. So I don't really know what the weather's doing out right now, but even when it was hailing earlier, above that, there was the clear blue sky. So the Satipatthana Sutta is about teaching us how to be aware of this clear, always be in the clear blue sky. to not identify with our thoughts and emotions. But it's not easy. It's not easy because we've got, all sorts of different factors come into play that mean that we really do identify ourselves with our thoughts, with our emotions. And a lot of conditioning has gone on in lots of different ways so that we behave automatically in ways we don't want to. But the Buddha said we can change. Okay, the Buddha said we can change. So why can we change? Why are we not always at the mercy of all this conditioning that we've had? So maybe we could start by looking at a couple of examples of ways that, small ways that I'm at mercy of my conditioning, of not just my conditioning, but my genetics as well. So the first one is my sometimes almost compulsive wish to eat, find myself eating sugary fat foods. Okay? It's a shame because whenever we give examples in Buddhism, they always seem to be about eating cake. But anyway, it's come back to cake again. So, because it is one that, is quite strong for me. And there are lots of different reasons why that is. So we can look at things at different levels of conditionality. So what make things happen? And conditionality causes coming together to create something to happen. And they can happen in different levels. So there are basic biological levels. So for instance, all of us, I think, are genetically, we evolved at a time when eating things that were full of sugar and fat was the thing we needed to do because there wasn't much sugar or fat around. So you wanted to eat the sweetest berries, you wanted to, I don't know what the fat would have been around, but that's what you wanted to eat. So there's like a genetic thing, which means that we are programmed to do that. But then at different levels, I think there's this kind of psychological level for me that in my family, none of me, my sisters, or my mum are particularly slim. So there's definitely something's happened there, which might be genetic, but it also, I think, is about our habits, that we've got psychological habits about reaching for food in particular situations. Then there's just the fact that I've many times in the past found myself reaching for a piece of cake or chocolate when I'm upset, or when I'm bored, or when I'm angry, or something like that. It's just I've done it loads and loads of times, so I've built up a kind of rut of doing it. So there's that level of a conditionality going on as well. So it's a bit like you could say there are different, so the levels there's genetic, which is biological. There's something kind of psychological going on, which is around my family. And there's something which you might call a kind of karmic level of conditionality going on, which is the fact that I've done it so many times before, I've just built up this habit of doing it. Another example I thought for me that I have a sort of quick response to is if somebody says something I think isn't true, I kind of really quickly go into quite an irritable and angry response. So an example I'll give is recently in the community, we were all just sitting around having lunch and somebody said something about a discussion we'd had earlier and I thought, that isn't true. And everyone else at the table kind of went, well, are you sure about that to the person? And I found myself sitting there going, but that's not true, which is like really not helpful actually, because it meant the person that I said it to presumably felt really, kind of threatened by that, a bit criticised by me saying that. Yeah, so there's something I do very quickly there. So again, you could look at that. Perhaps I've got genetically, I'm quick to not like something if it's not true, I don't know. There'll be something going on about my family conditioning there as well. And there'll also be the fact that I've done it many times before. So you can see there's different levels of conditionality going on. So because the Buddha said that everything that happens because of this mesh, this web of conditionality, in different ways, what happens is that our actions now will contribute to our future states of mind. So you remember on the newcomers course that we talk about how we create our future selves. So that what I do now, how I respond now to what's going on, means that I'm more likely to do the same in the future. And that will slowly, over time, create a whole personality. And then one of the strongest examples I've had of seeing that is when I worked for a little while in the evolution shop that used to be a gift shop. And I worked there at Christmas. And people would come up, it's very, very busy, big queues. And I was working on the till. I probably wasn't very fast on the till because I was just a kind of, Christmas person. But people would come up and some people would be really cross. You could see that it was getting them down doing their Christmas shopping. And they'd be a bit cross with me. So I wouldn't exactly be cross back, but I wouldn't be very friendly. So they were living in a world where there was quite unfriendly people. I was quite an unfriendly person working at the till. Then other people would come up and somehow, even in all that madness, they were quite friendly and they'd kind of chat with me and I'd be really friendly back. So they were creating a world in which they were coming across friendly people. And as you'll remember from the newcomers course, we talk about how that just kind of goes round and round, doesn't it? It's about some people are creating a world in which people they meet are unfriendly, so that means they're more likely to be unfriendly because they think people are unfriendly. Do you see what I mean? It's a kind of horrible cycle. And the other way around is if you're friendly and then people are friendly back to you, well, you're going to be even more friendly because you think, people are really nice, aren't they? I keep meeting all these lovely people. So there's this kind of way that we create the personality that we are, in the future. Every moment we're making choices. We're making choices which will affect the next moment. And now we can't affect all of those. Do you see what I mean? It's what I mean by that is we're making choices. We can't change everything, for instance. It's a bit like, however hard I wished and acted in certain ways, I'm not going to suddenly become a foot taller, okay? Because that's not, working on the level that we were talking about. But what I could do is I could be kinder and more generous to people, and then I would start to experience a kinder, more generous world. So that's like a law of conditionality that's going on there. And those conditions are happening all the time. So what the Buddha taught is everything is impermanent and things change all the time. And what we can do is by making choices, by making the right decisions, we can influence, we can take some kind of charge of that rudder of the boat and we can influence the direction that we go in. So that's one thing which allows us to free ourselves. The second is that we, as humans, have this ability to be self-aware. So we have what's called self-reflexive awareness. We're aware of what we're doing. And we have the ability to notice, to reflect upon, to make decisions about our behaviour, which I don't know if any other animals have. It's probably very difficult to tell, actually, but certainly we have that ability. But as I'll say later, we need to have space to do that in. But what the Buddha saw is that there's this conditionality going on, that we talked about everything. We can make decisions that will create the future, and we can also be aware. In fact, we have to be aware. If we're going to be able to guide the kind of person, the kind of life we'd like to lead in the future, we need to be aware. So this text, the Satipatthana Sutta, is all about awareness. You have the Satipatthana Sutta one? Okay, that's fine. So what we've got here is... these are called the Four Foundations. So in the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha outlined 4 foundations of mindfulness. Sati is a word meaning mindfulness. It looks like people at the back can't see it, actually, so I'll just read them out. So the top one is body. Then we've got Vedana with sensations, Chitta, thoughts and emotions, Dharma, mind objects. And I'll just say a little bit about those. So... so these are the 4 foundations. So body is so these are 4 processes that we can bring our awareness to. So the first is being aware of the experience of our bodies. The second is the experience of the sensations, what is called Vedana. The third is our thoughts and emotions, which is Chitta. And the fourth is what's going on in our minds, which is Dharma. What's going on in our minds seen through the perspective of a Dharmic understanding. Now, there I've used 3 words, which aren't English words, on purpose, because actually they have quite precise meanings that we can't translate that well. So if it's the first time you've come across these, hopefully gradually you'll start to use these words, because they are very precise meanings. So I'm going to look at each one a little bit more. So in a way, what you could say is that each of these, of all 4 together, they are what's going on in our experience for us. If we want to use that process of conditionality, use the fact that we're aware to change ourselves. And you could, in the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha starts off with asking us to bring our awareness to the body, then Vedana, then chitta, then dharma. But you could almost see it working the other way as well. So if we decide, so what we might decide is, for instance, I really want to practice the precepts a bit more. I want to be a little bit more generous. So in order to perhaps be a bit more generous, I need to understand what's going on in my mind. So I go somewhere and I kind of think, oh, I could give some money to this cause, okay? So I need to be aware of that mind object, you might say. And I need to be aware that that would be a dharmically positive thing to do, is to give some money, to be generous. But in order to be aware of that, I need to know that I'm having that experience. I need to know what's going on in my thoughts and emotions. So I need to be aware of the fact that I'm thinking I could give some money to this cause. And in order to know what's going on with my thoughts and emotions, I need to actually know what's going on in my body, in my sensations in Vedana, which I'm going to explain a bit more in a minute. And then below that, I also need to know what's going on in my body. So it's a bit like we start with something quite abstract and we move back till we get to what's actually going on, the actual sensations we're having in our body. But the way that the Buddha approached it was the other way, starting with the body. So, so the two that I'm going to really concentrate on talking about are Vedana and Chitta, so I'm going to spend more time on them. But the body. So the body, the practice here that we do is, of course, the mindfulness of breathing. So being aware of the breath. And the Buddha asked in the sutta, he says to the bhikkhus, he says, how bhikkhus does a bhikkhu abide contemplating the body as a body? Here a bhikkhu gone to the forest or to the root of a tree or to an empty hut sits down, having folded his or her legs crosswise, set his or her body erect, and established mindfulness in front of him or her. Ever mindful he or she breathes in, mindful he or she breathes out. So this is the words of the Buddha from 2,500 years ago, talking about the practices that we do. We sit cross-legged or we sit on a chair, we set our body erect, we establish mindfulness, and we become mindful of our breathing in and out when we do the mindfulness of breathing. So that's how the Buddha suggests that we become aware of breathing in meditation. But it's not just in meditation that we can be aware of what's going on in our body. So the Buddha also just thinks about, or suggests to us that we might want to think about what's happening, be aware of it ourselves in all our activities. So be aware of our body and everything we're doing. And the list that he suggested of things we do that we could be aware in included eating, walking, sleeping, putting on your robes, defecating, and a few other things. So it's like, well, those are things that the Buddha did. We all do those as well, maybe not put on robes when we get dressed, but also there's lots of other things we do where we can be aware of our body. The Buddha is suggesting that we can have some kind of level of awareness of our body all the time. So when we're driving, working, looking after our families, watching films, using computers, whatever it is that we do. Okay. So the Buddha also in the Satipatthana Sutta outlines a few other ways that we become more aware of our bodies, but I'm not going to go into those. I'm going to just really concentrate on Vedana and sensations. So Vedana, sensations, it's sometimes translated as feelings, but that's a little confusing, I think, because it's not emotions, it's before emotions. Feelings is what, Vedana is what we experience before we realise that we're having an emotion, before we have an emotion. It's our raw, bare experience, pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So the Buddha said some of our experience is pleasant, some of it's unpleasant, and some of it's neutral. So sometimes it's easier to be aware of our unpleasant Vedana. So maybe if you just sit for a minute or two, bring some awareness into your experience now, and notice where in your body you might be having some unpleasant sensations. Uncomfortable, maybe a little bit of pain somewhere. Just being aware of those unpleasant sensations. Without getting so caught up in them. Okay, and now Bringing your awareness to anything that's pleasant in your body. So there might be areas of your body that are feeling warm and relaxed. So just that's being those sensations that you're experiencing that are pleasant. That's pleasant Vedana. And the third kind of Vedana he talks about is neutral Vedana, which is stuff that we find not pleasant and not unpleasant. Interestingly, I find that when I investigate my experience, it usually is a bit unpleasant or a bit pleasant. So there's not much in my experience that I find to be neutral Vedana. But I suppose it could also be all the things that's happening that we're just not aware of. You know, all the things that are going on in our bodily experience that we're not aware of. So very naturally, we want to have more pleasant Vedana. We want more pleasant sensation, and we want to push away unpleasant Vedana. And neutral stuff we're just not really bothered about particularly. It doesn't particularly do anything. And I think that's a very simple part of being alive, being some kind of being in the world, some kind of sentient being, is that we go towards pleasant, we push away unpleasant. I think probably things like amoebas and things like that maybe do that as well. I'm not sure what level of life it would start, but it's a very kind of animal thing to do as well. So there's nothing wrong with it. So some things are pleasant, some things are unpleasant. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that if we find ourselves living a life where we're always trying to go towards the pleasant, get more and more pleasant Vedana, and push away unpleasant, we're going to find ourselves being lived by that rather than making decisions about what we want to do. So Vedana can be seen as the working ground of the spiritual life. But I don't think it's easy. We really do need to train in it. So I'm going to move on now to Chitta, which is heart-mind. So in Buddhism, we don't separate out thoughts and emotions in exactly the same way as we do in English. It's bringing together both thoughts and emotions, our heart and our mind together. So it's important here that the sutra is asking us to be aware of what's going on for us emotionally and in our thoughts. What's the shape of our heart and mind at the moment? But actually, what we often notice, I think the Chitta is very easy to notice, the Vedana not so easy to notice. So for instance, with the example I used of wanting some cake, it will be when I've started craving the cake that I notice what's going on usually. So that's Chitta, not Vedana. So what will have happened is I will have walked by that table downstairs in the tea room, and there'll have been some cake, and I'll have seen it. So I'll have had some kind of Vedana, some pleasant Vedana from seeing that cake, which will then lead me into craving, into wanting, thinking I want the cake. Not more than thinking, kind of having this strong physical experience of wanting the cake. And that is Chitta. And what I think we do is we kind of go back between Chitta and Vedana. So for those of you who've recently done a newcomers course, and those of you who've done it a while ago, you'll remember we talk about this, we talk about the gap. So we have that picture. I don't know how well you can see this, if you remember that. So basically we talk about how we have a situation. So the world or an event in our own mind pushes our buttons. So I see a piece of cake, I hear somebody say something that I think isn't true. And then what happens is we experience a pleasant or unpleasant feeling, which is Vedana, the word for that. Here it's called hedonic tone, which is quite a nice phrase, actually, hedonic tone. And that's our, and the same in there in feeling, as well as that, there's also the emotions often that go with that. That's the craving, wanting to eat something sweet, or feeling angry with somebody if they've said something that isn't true. And that's where, if you remember, we can have the gap. So we can notice what's going on for us, we can have the gap, and we can choose to act in a different way. So we can act in a more creative way. So what happens for us is we go round and round in vicious cycles if we're not careful. Like, for instance, smoking is the obvious example that you'll remember from the newcomers course, which is like we feel a craving for a cigarette, we have a cigarette, but what we're doing, of course, is we're creating the fact that in the future we're going to have craving for cigarettes again. And we go round and round doing that. In order to break that craving, we need to spend time in the gap, which is where we'll need to be with the unpleasant Vedana of staying with craving and not satisfying that craving by having another cigarette. And that would be true of all sorts of other things as well. So yes, our usual response is we grab at whatever we want, which gives us a pleasant sensation, or we push it away if it's uncomfortable. So what we can do is we can break out, and the gap is where we can break out. And then if you remember, the gap is where we can set ourselves up on a positive spiral, where we're creating a new self. So every time we don't have a piece of cake, every time if I manage, if I decide I'm not going to do cake, which sometimes I do, and then I don't have the cake, that's great. I'm creating a person who doesn't automatically think I need to always eat a piece of cake at the Buddhist Centre. I'm creating a person for whom it doesn't matter. I mean, you'll probably all know that from your own experience of breaking habits, that as you break them, you go through a very horrible period of being really aware of the craving or the aversion, but then after a while you become a person for whom it's no longer an issue. Okay, so yes, so this is why being aware of what's going on for us, our Vedana, our Chitta, is so important, because the gap is where we can change. The gap is where we can create a new self. But it's not always easy. It's not easy, particularly if we're having unpleasant Vedana. So I wanted to look at here a model of what happens when we experience unpleasant Vedana. So this has been developed by Vidyamala. The next one. Okay, so Vidyamala is a really amazing woman who lives with a lot of pain. She had 2 major accidents in her 20s and 30s, I think, which gave her a lot of trouble in her spine. She sometimes walks, but she usually uses a wheelchair. She's in pain a lot of the time. And she's developed a whole way of being with that pain, of being with unpleasant Vedana. Of actually turning towards it. So what she describes is, at the top we've got primary suffering. So primary suffering is that first feeling of unpleasant Vedana. Okay? It's just unpleasant Vedana of some sort. But what happens is, of course, we don't want it, so we resist it. So I start to feel guilty about something. I don't know if that is, or I start to feel discomfort, and I resist thinking about or feeling it. And that leads to what's called secondary suffering, where we kind of go off in all sorts of different ways around it. We have reactions to it. So an example would be, I'm feeling, so I'm thinking about something that I've done that I regret. And something I've been unskillful. Perhaps I said something to somebody and I regret saying it. And I start to feel like unpleasant Vedana because of that, because I'm feeling that kind of a horrible feeling you feel when you've said something you wish you hadn't. I could stay with it, but instead I don't want to feel that, so I start to feel a lot of resistance. And then what I do is I go off into secondary suffering. The next one. And secondary suffering, you can either block or drown. So blocking is where you deny it, and drowning it is where you're completely overwhelmed in it. So things that happen, so when we block, so if we're feeling this unpleasant Vedana, we block it. So that's where we try and push it away from us. We try and distract ourselves. So addictions like food, cigarettes, alcohol, excessive working, we get angry, we get irritable, we get very controlling. It's like we don't want to feel this and we block it, okay? The other thing we do is we drown in it. So we feel really overwhelmed by our unpleasant sensations, and we feel really wiped out, depressed, exhausted. We're just not interested in anything. This can be a kind of self-pitying kind of place to be as well. And we lose a whole sense of perspective, we catastrophize. So there's kind of 2 things we can do with unpleasant Vedana. One is we try and block it out, so we distract ourselves, so we keep working really hard, we watch telly, we're on Facebook all the time, we never give ourselves a moment to think because we're just on the go all the time. The other is we drown in it, we're so overwhelmed with it we can't get out of bed. So probably we all have different ways of dealing with our unpleasant Vedana. Some of us will mostly block, I think that's mostly my one, some of us will mostly drown. But of course at different times we'll do different ones. And so that's a way of a model of seeing unpleasant Vedana and how we respond to it. And I think the more that you think about how you respond and what the way might be, you can start to spot when you're doing it. Because, for instance, I'll find myself looking at something on my phone before I even know it. Do you see what I mean? And if I'm looking at something on my phone, I can think, what am I doing here? What am I blocking? And I can kind of replay what's just happened. And quite often I find there's like an uncomfortable Vedana, an unpleasant Vedana that I've experienced that's made me just suddenly get my phone out of my pocket and look at it. Or if you find yourself, really depressed, what is it underneath it that you might be trying to push away? Yes, so I've got some handouts with these on. So if these are of particular interest to you, I've got a few that I've printed out that I can give to you, because I find them a really helpful way of looking at unpleasant Vedana. Because personally, I find it really hard sometimes with unpleasant Vedana. It's like I so don't want to experience it, but I will do what I can to push it away. So it's really helpful to have an understanding, a way of seeing it. Okay, so that's negative Vedana. As well as negative Vedana and chitta. I mean, I think the two things, it's like our Vedana, but also our emotions as well. We're having strong emotions, we'll find ourselves blocking or drowning. I think most of us, my experience is most of the time I'm much more aware of the chitta, of the emotion and mind. When I'm meditating a lot, for instance, or in meditation, I sometimes become more aware of the Vedana, or I can trace back from an emotion to the Vedana. But I think you probably have to train yourself for a long time to be kind of living with, being aware of your Vedana all the time. Certainly not my experience. Okay, so as well as the unpleasant Vedana, there's neutral Vedana, which is all the Vedana you're not noticing. And there's a lovely phrase that I got from Vidyamala, which is about, as in time goes on, we defrost the icy landscapes of our experience that we aren't aware of. So for a lot of us, practicing is we gradually defrost those icy wastelands, those landscapes, and things that we didn't even know we felt, we start to feel and experience. And they stop being neutral Vedana, and they become either unpleasant or pleasant Vedana. But Vedana can be pleasant as well, and it can be pleasant in a really lovely way. So, for instance, if we're meditating and we experience our heart opening, that's pleasant, positive Vedana. And what we can do is we can start to choose to dwell on, to have in our experience our positive, pleasant Vedana. So, for instance, if you feel your heart opens when you think of a friend, like in the Metta Bhavana, perhaps, what we're doing in the Metta Bhavana, actually, is we are trying to allow positive Vedana to be much more part of our experience. What we're doing is we're putting our awareness on that so that it will gradually grow. What we dwell on is what we become. So what we're trying to do with this is dwell on things that are positive that will help us to grow. Okay. And then if we go back to that list of the thing, go back to the Dharma. Yeah. So the final thing that the Buddha asks us to examine in the Satipatthana Sutta is dharmas. And what this is seeing the content of our mind through the perspective of the Dharma. So this is where we might apply all those lists that we're learning. This is where we're actually not just trying to become happier, healthier beings, but we're trying to become enlightened. Because awareness, obviously, isn't necessarily ethical. So, for instance, somebody who's a sniper is going to be very, very aware. You can imagine that a sniper would be very aware of their breathing and their body. They'd be very alert. They'd be very clear on what they're trying to do, their aim, which is to kill somebody. So they're very mindful, but in Buddhist terms, they're not mindful. They're aware, but they're not mindful, because for a Buddhist, to be mindful is about also having a very clear ethical perspective on what you're doing and an idea of where you're trying to go. And next week, Dhamma is going to talk a lot more about these areas, about how we bring an awareness of what we're trying to do to our mindfulness. Okay, so those are the 4 foundations, and I'll just very briefly finish by talking about some attitudes we might bring to those. So I think the first is the Buddha talks about, as we practice the sutta, that we bring to mind our internal experience and our external. So it's not just our own stuff we think about, our own awareness, it is being aware of other people. Other people experience life just like we do. So they experience painful Vedana and they experience pleasant Vedana and neutral Vedana as well. So it's about, this is not just a practice that's just very self-indulgent about ourselves, it's a practice that actually links us to other people and other beings, seeing that other beings just experience the world in the same way that we do. I think another important thing to bring to this is a kindness. So sometimes bringing an awareness to our experience, to experience of our body, of our Vedana, of our emotions. But when I first started doing it, I certainly did it in quite a harsh and judgmental way, actually, which was really unhelpful. This isn't a thing about judging ourselves. This is a kind of curious process. It's about being curious about what's going on for us. And the kind of question of how interesting, I get angry. How interesting that this is what anger feels like. Not, oh, you bad person, you're angry again. Okay? There's kind of like a very different approach there. This is my human mind. Human beings get angry, they crave cake, that's what we do, you know. And this is just like, we're just bringing a sense of curiosity to that. And in that sense of curiosity, we can learn how we work and we can start to change it as well. So it's how can I live with this human mind? How can I free this human mind? There's an important point here which I think really helped me, which is that everything you're experiencing right now is what's called karma vipaka. So it's the fruits of your past actions. So if you're feeling angry right now, or you're feeling sad right now, or whatever it is, that is the fruits of past actions. In itself, at the moment, it is ethically neutral. It's how you respond to it that's the important thing. So if I get irritable, when I get irritable with people I think aren't saying things that are true, so that in itself, that feeling of irritability is neutral. It's what I do with that experience. So if I start feeling loads of shame about it, it's not very helpful actually. What's helpful is to respond in a creative way. So instead of kind of going, oh, you bad person, you're feeling irritable again, there's something about feeling that irritability, taking it right back to the Vedana, to the sensations, and then responding in a creative way, in a different way, because that will open up a new way of behaving. If I respond to my behaviour with anger for myself, with unhelpful shame, I'm just going to keep doing it. So it's about this, why the gap is called the point of freedom, is because we can really be free there. And for me, there's something about losing that kind of judgmentalness about the way I behave, because the way that I experience things, because that's the results of what I've done in the past. What I can change is how I respond to that, so how I behave is what I can change. Okay, so just briefly, how can we develop more awareness? It's interesting that it all comes back to the body. You know, what the Buddha said to us is it all comes back to the body. And so the more that we can be grounded in reality in our bodies, the better. And of course, modern life in many ways might mean that we're actually really out of touch with our bodies, very much in our heads. So things that will cultivate awareness, like going for walks, giving yourself a little bit of time, doing nothing, or a little bit of time doing kind of something kind of, I'm not sure what to call it, but like crafty or manual labour. You know, those kind of things where you're doing something with your hands, but you can kind of actually have time just to be there and be aware of it. Exercise, time reflecting on what's going on for you. And of course, the mindfulness of breathing, metta bhavana, these will all help us be in our bodies, be much more aware of what's going on in those 4 different areas. I think also another thing we can do is actually bring to mind the Buddha. Because as well as like being aware of that we're moving, it's really good to have the idea in front of us, the ideal that we're moving towards. So I think bringing to mind the Buddha or other Buddha figures or bodhisattvas that appeal to you can be a way that we can kind of imaginatively connect with where we're going with this. And I suppose a really great way to do that would be come to Buddha Day, which is a week on Sunday, where we will have a chance to really bring to mind the Buddha and really rejoice in his many qualities. Okay, so I'll just finish with a quote. So the Buddha said, after he'd finished his teaching, he starts off by kind of going, if you practice like this for 7 years, you'll definitely get enlightened. And then he goes, but it doesn't have to be 7 years. It could be 6 years, it could be 5 years, 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, for 1 year. And then he goes, but if you develop these 4 foundations of mindfulness just for 7 months, for 6 months, for 4 months, for 3 months, for 2 months, for half a month, these could be for you, let alone half a month. If you do it for 7 days, you will have, either be completely enlightened or pretty much nearly there. So it's only 7 days worth of practicing awareness, and you can be enlightened. So.